not breaking any news here. We live in spiritually perilous times. It seems like danger is all around us or our family spiritually all the time. But our God hasn't left us defenseless. We read in Ephesians chapter 6 verse 17, "And take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God." So in our spiritual battles, the scriptures are our sword. But just like real swords, not all canon of scripture are made equal. You need to make sure that you're entering the battle with the right gear. With that thought in mind, Drew Briney and others have been working on a project to bring you what is now being called the restored version of the scriptures. So, what is the restored version of the scriptures? The restored version is the most accurate, exhaustive, comfortable to read triple combination ever made. It was designed to honor Joseph Smith's revelatory words and edits through clean and accurate Joseph approved texts. The restored version contains each book found in the modern LDS triple combination. That is the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price, except it has Joseph's original inspired text in an easy to read format. It restores the lectures on faith, which were removed in 1921. It adds an additional 87 uncanonized revelations of Joseph Smith, as well as 33 revelations received by Brigham Young, John Taylor, and Wilford Woodruff, and other members of the Quorum of the Twelve. Each copy of the restored version is built to last. These scriptures look good, feel comfortable, and are bound to last. The restored version uses cover material that is ideal for high-quality books that is both hard-wearing and soft, and should handle many years of use. It has beautiful gold and silver gilded edges. It has sturdy, flexible binding, making it so the book may comfortably and safely be laid on a desk. It has reliable paper that is very thin, yet sturdy and thick enough that it's hard to see through, and comes with marking ribbons so that you never lose your reading place. Each copy of the restored version are built with the intent of lasting for years and years, just like the LDS versions of the triple combination. You might be asking yourself, what are the benefits of owning your own copy of the restored version of the scriptures? Well, how's this for starters? Number one, the spiritual significance. The restored version contains every known revelation of Joseph Smith, as well as those of his first successors. The historical significance. While the foundational text for the restored version is the latest edition of each book of scripture that Joseph approved, the restored version carefully documents through footnotes, italicized texts, every substantive change made by Joseph or his editing committee, making the restored version a truly original set of scriptures. Formatting significance. The restored version contains no columns, no cumbersome cross references, and no paragraph breaks at every verse, just like the original, and has been improved with many verse numbers in the paragraphs, which provide a smooth, seamless reading experience that makes it easy to lose track of time while reading and makes it easier to see the larger narrative within the scriptures. It is also the first original editions published that can be used with study guides, since almost all of the other originals don't have verses in it. The restored version offers pure doctrine in the most historically transparent Mormon triple combination ever made, with a modern format that provides for a smooth, seamless, and spiritual read. Now, to get your copy today, just go to www.restoredscriptures.com or click the link in this episode's show notes. Again, that is www.restoredscriptures.com, or click the link in this episode's show notes and order your copy today and arm you and your family with the Word of God. Now, let's get back to our conversation. Leo, it's nice seeing you again, sir.
Good to see you.
You know, when we went to Plymouth a few months back, it was absolutely one of the highlights of the trip is being able to be there in Plymouth. There is so much history there. And as we were walking away from your little museum and gift shop there, my wife Amber, who knows me so well, she says, "That's kind of who you want to be when you grow up, isn't it?" I was like, "Man, if I could have a store like that, absolutely." Like I was so blessed to be there, and thank you for welcoming me in and taking the time to talk with me both then and now, Leo.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.
So, real quick, how did you get into all this history?
It was a mistake. My wife and I moved here 25 years ago, and I was a contractor and she was a photographer. We did that together. We were looking for a photography studio. She found the grist mill empty, hadn't been used for 3 years. So she went to look at it and said, "I found the perfect spot for photography," and told me to come look at it. I went and looked at it. And I saw all these gears and the wheel and everything else, and it was beautiful. And I said to the landlord, I said, "What is this thing?" He said, "Well, it's the site of the oldest mill in the country." I said, "Really?"
Wow.
He said, "Yeah." He said, "What do you think?" I said, "Well, I think I want to run it." It took me 4 years, 4 months to get the building in good enough shape to run. I started running the mill and I gave tours there. I gave a tour at 9 in the morning. Then I went and worked on building a house and I came back at 4 in the afternoon and gave another tour. And my wife stayed there all day. So that was a catalyst of what we're doing here. We were leasing the mill and the landlord leased it to somebody else. So we moved out and we got the house we're in now, the one you came to, and we were given that house. We got that house free. We were
Wow.
given to, yeah, another nonprofit went out of business, and you can't keep the assets. You have to give it to another nonprofit. And so they gave it to us, and we've been up in that building for oh 10 years, over 10 years, doing the story of the Pilgrims.
Wow. Wow. And at what point are you there? Is that when you really start diving into the history of everything there at Plymouth?
Well, yeah, we did a history a little bit up at the grist mill. See, the grist mill, the man that ran the grist mill, his name is John Jenny, and he got paid to run the mill, which means he's the first person in the country to be paid for a service. So capitalism in our country began in that mill where he got paid. But he got paid in corn, not money. Money had no value in Plymouth. What are you going to
Right.
do with money? The corn was the money. He got 2 quarts every time he ground a bushel, and he couldn't charge more than that. So not only did he start capitalism, he also started controls. He had to stay in a certain control because we're all human and we all push the limit. But
Sure.
that's what happened. And so I ran that mill and I started doing an economics talk, biblical economics at the mill.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And when I came into Plymouth, uh, I remember I stopped off at the visitor center and I kind of, told them who I was. I was looking for someone to talk to me about this. And they said, "Oh, you need to go talk to Leo." But they were like, "But be warned, he's super religious." And I'm like, "It's okay. I
Yeah,
think me and Mr. Martin will get along okay in that regards, right?" Like, um,
perfect. Yeah.
so were you always kind of a religious guy as you approached this?
Well, yeah, I'm an evangelical Christian, and I became a Christian in 1980. Uh,
Okay,
but I had a contracting business and a photography business. Then I started doing the mill, and somebody said to me, "Do you know the Christian history of this place?" And I said, "I don't. Who do I talk to?" So there's a guy named Paul J. Lee. He's a pastor. He knows all the Christian history. So give him a call. I did. And I said, "Paul, my name's Leo Martin. I'm running the grist mill and I need the Christian story of the country. That's what I want to tell. Can you give me anything?" He said, I don't know. I don't know if I have anything. Give me a day or two." The next day I had a stack of papers on my desk telling all of the Christian history of our country. And so Paul and I got together. We worked for quite a long time together. We still do, about telling the founding of our country on Christian principles.
gotcha. Well, let's just get into that, Leo. So so often, I'm going to use my own example here. As I grow up, I don't grow up in a religious household at all. I make a conversion later on in life, about 18 years old. I make a conversion. And um as I get into it, I start seeing God moving all over the place in American history. Specifically that period there with the Pilgrims and that sort of stuff, the founders, that sort of thing. So much so it inspires me and my wife to move to the Eastern Shore of Maryland just so we can be closer to the history and get a better feel for it. And so as a kid growing up, like Thanksgiving was great. Loved it, right? But I loved it because of the food. I loved
Sure.
it because I get to, sit down and watch a ton of football.
Yeah.
Um, but I was really, I loved the ability to, cut out the pilgrim silhouette and, the whole thing when you do when you're in grade school, right? That was all fun. But you really don't get the religious significance, the spiritual significance of what happens in Plymouth until you talk to a guy like yourself or you do your own research. So let's talk a little bit about that spiritual history because I think that by far outweighs the football, the turkey, the fun crafts or any of those other things, right? There is a definite story that's told there from God himself, I believe, on some of that. So let's dive in that. Who were the Pilgrims?
Well, the Pilgrims were covenant people. They followed the new covenant. That Jesus Christ was their Lord and Savior, and all you had to do was believe that, and you were saved. And that's what they believed. So now they're a product of the Reformation, and they're covenant people. Now, what happened in England at that time? If you lived in England then, we had this guy called King James. Now, King James was the king, and he was the head of the church. So when he set the law, he set the law for everybody. Everybody in England sat under the same rule of law, of course, except King James. He was above the law. He didn't have to follow
Right.
his own law. Not only that, if you belonged to his church, the Anglican church, and you wanted to pray, knock your lights out, pray all day long as the subject of your prayer was King James. He thought he was God, divine right of kings. That kind of
Right.
rubbed our pastor the wrong way. John Robinson, the pastor of the Pilgrims, took his folks out of the Anglican church and they had church in their homes. In other words, the Pilgrims separated from the Church of England. That's why we're called separatists. Another group back then, theologically similar to the Pilgrims, stayed in the Anglican Church and tried to purify it from within. We call them the Puritans. They came 10 years later and founded Boston. But this is a very big difference because when they did that, separated from the church, they never wanted to see one person in charge of everything ever again, like the king. So Pastor Robinson had his congregation elect him pastor, not appoint him. Appoint him, you can't get rid of him. Elect him, you can dump him. But you know what?
Right.
Yeah. But you know what that did for us? That started self-rule in our country. The result,
Absolutely.
the Mayflower Compact. First document to self-rule, where we elected John Carver, the first freely elected official in the United States. But to step back for a minute, when they separated from the church in England, they started church in their homes. And they started the church in a home in Scrooby, England. And when they did that, they wrote a covenant, the Scrooby Covenant. And this is what the Scrooby Covenant said. As the Lord's free people join themselves by a covenant of the Lord into a church estate in the fellowship of the gospel, to walk in all his ways made known or to be known to them, according to their best endeavor, whatever it should cost them, the Lord assisting them. So now what they just did is they formed a church with Jesus Christ in charge, and they would love one another and commit to one another, and that would be their covenant. Now here's the deal. You had to belong to the King's church. That was the law. You didn't have to belong to this church. But if you're going to belong, follow the covenant. Very simple. You don't have to come, but if you do, follow the covenant. And so they wrote that covenant, and of course it was an illegal church. So they were forced,
Right.
yeah, they were forced out of England, went to Holland for 12 years where they could worship freely. Of course, the question is, why didn't they just stay in Holland? They could worship freely. Yeah, but
They
it
got
was,
great tulips.
well, yeah, beautiful. But not only could they worship freely, it was so liberal, their kids were learning the liberal ways of the Dutch. So they were losing their
Right.
children. They were getting older and they had to make another move. And that move was to Plymouth. Well, actually, it was supposed to be to Northern Virginia, but they ended up in Plymouth. They missed the mark by 200 miles. So when they came here, uh, they set up their own church. Now, not only could they worship any way they want, they could set up the government any way they want because they was building their own community. So now they come here and they're building a covenant, but again, they landed in the wrong place. They weren't supposed to land on Cape Cod. They were supposed to land in Northern Virginia, so we had no law to be here. They had to write
Right.
their own law, and that law is the Mayflower Compact. See, on that boat, there were two groups of people. There were the separatists, which were called the saints, and the other group were called the strangers. The strangers, not a derogatory term, they just weren't in our congregation, so we called them strangers, but they didn't like us. And they didn't want to live under the rule of the Pilgrims. So when we landed here in Plymouth and had no law to be here, they said, we don't like you people, we're leaving. And there's nothing you can do about it. There's no law to keep us here. And of course, they were right, except they just landed on the tip of a sandbar in the middle of an ice storm, 102 people and absolutely nothing else. Half are going to leave. John Carver said, you will not sit under our rule. We will have self-rule. Every man on this boat gets a vote. But once a vote's taken, everybody follows the one who won the vote, whether you voted for him or not. Carver was unanimously elected the first governor, which is kind of a miracle because they didn't
Yeah.
like it. They couldn't stand us. but it was
Right.
universally elected. And of course, how does that happen? That happens because the Pilgrims practiced the number one commandment. Love God, love your neighbor, love yourself. When you do that, miracles happen. When you don't, chaos. And so here we are writing our new government, the Mayflower Compact, and the Mayflower Compact is also a covenant under God that we would form a body politic with God in charge. Here's one of the lines of the Mayflower Compact. In the name of God, amen, the first line. We use names are underwritten, the royal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God of Great Britain, France, Ireland, King, Defender of the Faith, etc., having undertaken for the glory of God the advancements of the Christian faith and the honor of our King and country, voyage to plant first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually, excuse me, in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic. I'm just gonna take a minute there. Get wet my throat.
No, you're good.
Excuse me. So what just happened now? Back in England, the power structure went from God to the king, God's representative on earth, to the people. In the Mayflower Compact, undertaken for the glory of God, the advancement of the Christian faith, the people, and honor of our king and country, the king, or the representative. Now the power structure just changed.
Yep.
It goes from God to the people, to the king or the representative. Now they're responsible to the people as long as the people stay responsible to the law of God.
Right.
Civil government, the people are in charge, changed the world. So they came here and they elected their own officials. And of course, Governor Carver being the first, but with that comes a responsibility. Our responsibility is for people in office who have character, integrity, and virtue. And if we do not do that, we're going to have a problem. In other words, we have to keep the covenant. That covenant, the Mayflower Compact, that's still valid today. The only thing we have to do is keep it. As long as we don't keep it, we're going to have chaos. Because
Right.
God's a God of order. So if you take God off his throne and remove him, you have chaos. But not only do you have chaos, now you have another little problem. Who's going to take the place of God? It's a void.
Right.
Somebody has to take the place of God. And what happened today is we've removed God from his throne.
Yep.
And we've caused chaos. Now we replaced God from his throne with the government.
Hmm.
Now the government thinks it's God, and we have to worship it. We're right back to where we were with King James. And we have to stop doing that. We have to make the covenant valid again, put God back on his throne. That's what the Pilgrims were all about. They were solid covenant people. And of course, I did a podcast once with a gentleman by the name of Glenn Beck. And Glenn said to me, Leo, what's the big deal about a covenant? I said, I'll tell you what, Glenn, if I make you a promise and I break it, who cares other than you? But if I make a promise with God as my witness, I better be pretty darn serious. And that's what,
Right.
yeah, and that's what the Pilgrims were. They made a covenant with God as their witness and they refused to break it. I made a covenant with my wife 52 years ago that we would stay married, and we're still married because the covenant was a promise with God as my witness. And I felt I had to keep that covenant. Do you think it was easy? No, just ask her. Anyway, yeah. So now we got this wonderful covenant people, and it shows in everything they did. Why they didn't go back, how they honored one another, wrote a peace treaty with the Indians, got along with them for 55 years. This all comes under the covenant. And in the and covenants happen all the time. Again, I made a covenant. The peace treaty we signed with the Indians was a covenant with them.
Right.
Points. If we do this, you'll do this. If we do this, you'll do this. And we made that covenant and we kept it for 55 years. So that's who they were. Not only that, there is a difference between us and Jamestown. Jamestown came first, but we're called America's hometown. Why is that? Because Jamestown went there to get rich. We came here
Yep.
as families. When you go someplace as families, you better get along with the people that are there. And we wrote,
Yeah.
yeah, and we wrote that peace treaty. And we got along 55 years together, the longest lasting peace treaty with the Indians in our country's history. And
Mm.
that's who the Pilgrims were all about, the covenant people.
It's so fascinating because in Mormon theology, this idea of making covenant is huge,
I
right?
know. Yeah,
It is a big deal. And there are so many things I can look back. And I want to be clear. I think covenant should be a huge thing for any Christ-centered people. I think it's that important.
yeah,
And I think that, look, even within Mormonism, speaking on the whole here, certainly we talk a lot about covenants, but I don't think we always understand just the severity of those issues that you are engaging in, right? It
yeah,
either has the ability to bless your efforts in such a way that the windows of heaven open, or if you make that covenant and then back out of it, it can absolutely be to your ruin, right?
correct. Yeah,
Um, and covenant is an important thing. We find it all throughout the Old and New Testament. Um, and to see this sort of thing happen with those pilgrims, those early separatists from the Church of England, is is really something that I think we need to keep in the forefront of our minds, because I do believe in a national covenant, right? I do believe that Mayflower Compact was part of it, and I
yes, it
do
is.
think that there were covenants involved in the foundational revolutionary periods of America, that we have not walked up to in the last probably 100 years, I would imagine.
Yeah,
Um, and if we want to, like, I'm going to get beat up for this. Look, I voted for Trump. I did. But if you want to make America great again, she's got to return back to her covenants.
correct. No doubt. That's the only way. And we do it through the family, not through the
Yep.
government. See, when you're in the family, you have to learn how to govern your children. My wife and I, you and your wife, have to govern your children. Well, how do you learn to govern them if you can't govern yourself? So the first thing you have to do to govern yourself is become a person of faith. Now you have a standard to work by, biblical law. And now you govern yourself. Now you know how to govern your children. And once you govern your children, you make them good civil servants. I believe in civil government. Everybody should get a vote, but not my children. I'm their tyrant until they're old enough to understand how to behave in public and how to live under biblical law and live as a person of faith. And once they do that, now they're free to go on their own and do their thing. We just made somebody that is going to be an asset to the community rather than a detraction from the community. I haven't done this my whole life. For 30 years, I was a building contractor. I built and remodeled homes. I spent half my life 40 feet in the air. I'm handicapped today. I can't get up on a stool. Now it's my son's turn to take care of me because I took care of him for 45 years. Then when he gets to my age, it's time for his son to take care of him. And that cycle keeps happening. And once we get that cycle happening and we build strong families, now we're going to build a strong church and a strong community and a strong federal government. And it has to start in the family, not in the government.
100%. Um, I I couldn't agree with that more. I think so many of our problems, in addition to not living up to that national covenant, has been the disintegration of the nuclear family. I think that has done more damage to society at large than perhaps anything other than covenant that I could think of. And quite frankly, if we were living the covenant, I don't think we'd see divorce like we see it now either,
Right.
right? We would
I
have
agree.
stronger families.
Yeah.
So I want to go back to something you had said there about how the strangers ended up being won uh, over by the pilgrims, and I'm I think I'm familiar with the story here. I think it has to do with illness, but exactly how did they win over the strangers, right?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Where did they come from in the first place? There was an economic deal made with the person financing the trip here. This was the economic deal. You would go to the New World, you would work 6 days a week. Of those 6 days, four would go to me for 7 years, and you keep two as a personal profit. At the end of 7 years, you own the property you personally developed. Not a bad deal. They took it. They get in on the boat. Weston, this man, shows up on the dock, says, I'm changing the deal. You're going to work 6 days of 6 days for me for 7 years. And at the end of 7 years, I own half your property. They had already sold everything they had. Now they're getting there and they're getting ready to come over here. So they took the deal, except some people wouldn't do it because they were virtually indentured servants. So those people wouldn't get on the boat. Now you have a boat that's half empty. What do? You put it out to bid. Anybody that can pay the freight, they can get on the boat and come over. So now half the boat is separatists and half the boat is strangers, totally different thinking people, which I think is hysterical. Here we
Yeah,
have a bunch of separatists saying, look, I'm going to separate. We're going to start our own church. Don't bother me. I won't bother you. And what does God do? Puts half the people on the boat that don't think like him, like them. You're not you're not separating from anybody. You get along.
right.
So now they have to build a community. And what they did is said, have church on every Sunday. And the way they conducted that is they had a drummer studying the pace, the preacher, the governor, Miles Standish, the leader of the army, then the people in the back, men on the outside holding guns in case animals came out, walk through town up to Burial Hill where they had the service. And they'd be up there, and in the morning, they would have a sermon for 4 hours. Then they have lunch. In the afternoon, they came back and talked about that sermon for 4 more hours. That was called prophecy. Now, anybody in Plymouth, because they did that, could could deliver a sermon at the drop of a hat. That's how well they knew the Bible. So by
Wow.
doing this way, everybody's on the same page. Everybody can read the Bible. Everybody can deliver the Bible. And that's how they conducted their church service. So you'd be at church on Sunday for 8 hours.
Wow.
Yeah,
And we complain about too.
I know it. Yeah.
I mean, that's nothing compared to what those guys were doing.
No, it
But
was
you can't argue with the results, right?
exactly right. Exactly. So now, everybody's so steeped in the Bible. But of course, as you grow, then we have Mass Bay come in and other people come in and things expand. You can't control things the way you did. We only have one community, Plymouth. And so things began to get out of hand. 55 years later, after the peace treaty, it was broken. And so things began to change dramatically. And it's changed from then till today. And of course, people ask me all the time, well, did the Pilgrims pass that covenant thinking to the founding fathers who wrote the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution? And of course they did. But what happens in our world today is people don't want this to be a Christian nation. There are a group out there that don't want it to be Christian. It's all depends on your worldview. I have a biblical worldview. The Pilgrims had a biblical worldview, but some people don't. They have a different worldview. They leave out the Christian history. They leave out the religion of our country. So what they want to do is remove it from our country. So they change the way things are done. And what happens is people start calling the founding fathers, they weren't Christians, they were deists. And a deist
Hmm.
is a person who believes there's a God up there being God, but he's not a personal God. He doesn't bother with us. So they're deists. And I was told Thomas Jefferson was a deist. But here's the problem. He wrote the Declaration of Independence, certain inalienable rights from God. Thomas Jefferson just told me, I have a personal God. How could he possibly be a deist? But we change things. So people believe it's a secular worldview or country, not a religious Christian country. And they try to remove that. I was told Benjamin Franklin was a deist. Benjamin Franklin. And of course, he was one of the smartest guys ever. He invented everything Franklin.
It was the Elon Musk of his day.
Oh, I'll tell you, he invented the stove, bifocals. Do you know he invented sidewalks, the lending library, fire stations? He invented the catheter. What was he thinking? Anyway, he's the smartest guy around. So smart guys like that usually don't need God. But they're having a constitutional convention. They're trying to write the
Right.
Constitution. 13 different states. Nobody got along. 100 degrees in the building. He stands up and he addresses George Washington at the convention. How has it happened, sir, that we have not hitherto once thought to humbly appear, of humbly appealing to the Father of lights to illuminate our understandings? In the beginning of the contrast with Great Britain, when we were sensible to danger, we had daily prayers in this room for divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that we can start an empire without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings, except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. I firmly believe this, and he's called a deist. They try to change what happens and change the whole history of our country. That's why it's so important for us to teach our children the real history of the country, or we're going to lose it. And we're going to lose the covenant. They're trying to remove it. And that's obvious today. And
Absolutely. As I alluded to earlier, I've always been just a nerd for the US founding, right?
yeah,
Loved the founding, especially the Revolutionary period. And one of the things I've noticed is that the term progressive, if you follow it back to its earliest incarnation as a political movement, they made no efforts to hide it. They want to progress past the Constitution, right?
correct. Yeah,
And in order to do that, you have to discredit the messengers that delivered that,
that's right.
right? And so how do they deliver that? How do they get past that? Well, one is that they turn the founders into something that they're not, right?
Yeah,
I remember I was this was back when we were living back west. I was sitting at the dinner table and gathering her up as a family for dinner. I asked my kids, what'd you learn at church today? And they said, "Oh, well, gosh, we learned about history and we learned that a lot of the founders were just rich white slave owners." And I
yeah,
remember I dropped my fork on my plate and I was like, "What did you just say?"
yeah,
Right? Like, and because at this point in my life, I had done all my own research. I'd read original sources. I'd read Madison's notes. I get it. I know what they were trying to do. Right.
yeah,
And a big part of that moving past the messenger is discrediting the message, right? And you do that by calling the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob a racist, evil God, right?
correct. Yeah,
And that we've seen that perpetrated now for the better part, in my opinion, at least 75 years. And I think we are at a tipping point as a society where I think we're back, quite frankly, to that Old Testament phrase where the Lord's kind of asking us, you this day you will choose. You'll
mm,
choose life and light, or you'll choose darkness and death. But you're at a point of choosing now. So there's a lot within the Pilgrim story that I think beckons us to make a return to that covenant and certainly back to solid principles. But we have to kind of study their lives a little bit, right? We can't just do what I did for my whole young life and just think that this story is about turkey and football and arts and crafts. But one of the things I wanted to talk about was just what kind of absolute hardship these people had to deal with. They make landfall in December, right, Leo? Is that correct?
yeah. End of November, beginning of December. Yeah, yeah.
Right. Now, if I'm not mistaken, there were how many people originally on the boat? 100 and something?
102,
And by the time that first winter's over, how many's left?
51.
51. So they lost over half of what went on there. What are they facing as they get off, as they get off the boat? What is it they're up against?
Well, keep in mind, they when they originally left England or Europe, they had two ships, one called the Speedwell, one called the Mayflower. They owned the Speedwell, they leased the Mayflower. The Speedwell picked our friends up in Holland, brought them to England, met the Mayflower, and came over. When they left England, the Speedwell leaked twice. They had to sell it for half what they paid for it, lost their investment. 20 of the original passengers had to stay behind, and they left late. When they landed on the tip of Cape Cod, they had run out of food. The men looked around the Cape, found a stash of corn buried in the ground by the Indians, and they took it. They did not steal the corn, they borrowed it, they paid it back later. Had they not taken the corn, they never would have survived. Because you see, by the end of that first winter, they were doling out a quarter pound of cornbread per person per day to survive on. So, as you can well imagine, the mothers took their bread and fed their children. They covered their children with their own bodies to keep them warm. Of those 18 married women, 14 died the first winter, sacrificing themselves for the next generation, knowing if they did not survive, we would not survive. And we have a statue of the Pilgrim Mother. And on the back of that statue, it says, they brought their families in a sturdy virtue and a living faith in God, without which nations perish. And
Hmm.
while the women making that tough decision, the men were making another one. Hold back some of that corn. If they had no seed corn to plant for the first season, they never would have survived. They called that the starving time. That's just a picture of who they were and what they went through. And I'll be honest with you, without the women, we would not be here. Their sacrifice saved the plantation.
Absolutely. So as women are dying, right? And sometimes I think it's hard for us living in the modern day with our modern conveniences. We have the ability to bounce back after tragedy in ways that, quite frankly, our predecessors didn't have, right?
Yeah.
Oftentimes, the loss of a mom, especially the mother, ended up in kind of a dissolution of the family, right? So, what happens with all those orphans, right? Because I got to imagine there was a ton of orphans given the circumstances. What happens to them?
Well, what would happen with them is they would be taken in by another family, a surviving family.
Mm.
We had, of all the people that died the first winter, only two families did not lose a person. Everybody else lost at least one person that first winter. So what you would do is you would go, Elizabeth Tilley, her folks died. She went in and stayed with John Carver. And this is what would happen. As people died, they would join another family. And John Howland was a servant to John Carver. He lived with Carver too. The Carvers died, and Howland took over his property, which was unheard of. That just didn't happen. He was a
Right.
servant. So now he takes over the property, ends up marrying Elizabeth Tilley, who was taken in by the Carvers because her parents died. And that what ended up there is John Howland, the descendants of John Howland, is the largest descendancy in the country. At his family reunion.
Oh, that's
Yeah, well, we
so
had over
fascinating.
we had over 1,500 descendants attend his reunion, and some you may be familiar with, a gentleman by the name of President Bush. So that means
Yeah.
two presidents, but he covered both sides of the aisle. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Sir Winston Churchill, all descendants of John Howland, Joseph Smith.
Really?
Yeah,
Is a descendant of Carver.
he's a descendant of Howland. That,
Holland, excuse me.
yeah, and
Wow.
and
Holy cow.
yeah, a few years ago, about 2013, I gave President Ballard from your church a tour that I talk about, and he is also a descendant of John Howland.
Holy cow.
Yeah,
That wow. And that's something I think that we can't discount, right? I think so often we look at our what we do in life and we think, well, this is just what I'm doing. It's not going to have an impact,
right.
right? But we don't get the gift of perspective often in this life, right? W- If we're lucky, our kids and our grandkids will get it.
Yeah, if we're lucky.
If we're lucky,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
But you look at a man like Holland and his impact that he's had, not just on this country, right? But ultimately, Winston Churchill, right? I mean, what's the chances that a descendant of Holland two descendants of Holland end up on the same side of fighting for freedom, for liberty, for
Yeah,
man to govern himself,
correct.
right?
Yeah,
That comes from Holland. That gentleman.
yeah.
That
Amazing.
is incredible. So at what point, and this is something that I've wanted to talk about for a long time. At How is it that the Pilgrims were able to forge such a long-lasting treaty with the Native Americans? And not only just a treaty of, hey, let's not kill each other, but like there's no doubt Plymouth does not survive if not for the intervention of the Native Americans. Is that
That-
correct?
That's correct. Yeah. So we signed a peace treaty with them because, again, their thinking is we're all made in the image of God. And if we're going to come here and start a society and have nothing to do with England as families, we better get along with the people that are here. And they firmly believe that we're all equal in the sight of God. So we all had the same value. So they got along with the Indians and they signed a peace treaty early on. But now keep in mind, we're all human and we all have self-interest. Self-interest isn't always bad. Self-interest could be good. When it becomes bad is when it becomes selfish. But their self-interest is okay. See, Massasoit, the chief of the Wampanoag, had just gone through a plague and that tribe was weak. So they needed us and our guns to help protect them from the other tribes. And of course, we're in a foreign country. We just lost half our population. And we didn't pick the Pilgrims to do what they do because they could farm or they could hunt. We picked them because of their commitment. So now we
Right.
have to learn how to do all this stuff. And Squanto and the Wampanoags taught them how to farm and how to produce to keep the community going. So without them, without Squanto, who lived with them, they wouldn't have survived. So it became a community where we were relying on one another. But I'm sure you know this. It's hard for us to pass from one generation to the other the good information that they need to know. And it
Yeah.
skips a generation. And that happened with the Pilgrims. That biblical knowledge skipped a generation. Edward Winslow was one of the greatest negotiators ever with the Indians and with everybody else. He had a son called Josiah. Josiah Winslow became governor, and he was a catalyst for the King Philip War.
Uh,
Yeah. Now, King Philip was Massasoit's son. His Christian name was Philip. And so what happened is they went to negotiate not to go to war. And King Philip looked at Winslow and said, hey, you're just a governor. I'm a chief. I will only talk to kings. And he broke off the negotiations and they went to war. See, that skipped a generation. Either one of those guys could have stopped that war, but they were arrogant and they weren't what their fathers were, and they missed it. And that started the King Philip War because we didn't pass that biblical knowledge to the next generation. And what was the result? The largest percentage of population was killed in that war than any war in our country's history.
wow. Back to guys like Squanto and Massasoit. What is it about those guys that take pity on on the on the Pilgrims? Is it just this idea of, hey, a mutual alliance here can be beneficial? Is there any indication, especially from the perspective of the Native Americans? I know they weren't huge on written histories, but do we have anything that would indicate how they viewed the Pilgrims?
Not much, but the story is a little different than you usually hear. Squanto was taken to England as a slave,
Mm,
learned English, and came back. And he was the interpreter between the Indians and the Pilgrims to write the peace treaty. He's the only one that knew both languages. So that's how they wrote the peace treaty. But here's the issue. Governor Bradford referred to him as a special gift from God. Massasoit did not. See, what happened is we wrote the peace treaty, then Squanto would go up to Bradford and he'd say, look, Massasoit's going to attack you. He says, what are you talking about? I just signed a peace treaty. He said, I know, I'm just telling you. And then nothing happened. So Bradford would say to Squanto, nothing happened. He said, I know, I talked him out of it. Squanto was trying to get Bradford to kill Massasoit so he could be chief.
Really?
Yeah. So Massasoit says, give him back. I want Squanto. I'm going to kill him. He says, you can't have him. He's my interpreter. So Massasoit says, okay, no problem. Within a year, Squanto was dead.
Oh,
So
really?
we have an undercurrent here of people being people. Uh, and they were also leery of Massasoit, of Squanto, because he lived with the English. So he thought, oh, he's probably going to be on the side of the English too. So we gotta get rid of this guy. But so that's the undercurrent with what happened. Uh, and under that peace treaty, we should have given him back, but we didn't. But he ended up dying anyway. And, and so as you look at the nuances of the whole thing, people are people, and for the most part, the big good guy here is Massasoit. Massasoit was really a good negotiator, but he needed us. And the other good guy was Winslow, because Winslow was a was our connection to the Indians. When we wrote the peace treaty, you saw my building. It's on a river. On one side is Watson's Hill. That's where the Indians were. On the other side is Burial Hill. That's where the Pilgrims were. They're going to write a peace treaty. So Governor Carver says to Massasoit, come on over, we'll write a peace treaty. He says, I'm coming, but I want a hostage over here until I get back.
Right.
That hostage was Winslow. So Winslow went over to their camp, stood there while they signed the peace treaty, and when it was done and Massasoit came back, Winslow got back to our community. So they were filling each other out, seeing exactly what's going on. But again, that peace treaty was a covenant that they would protect one another. Someone attacks you, we'll fight for you. Someone attacks us, you'll fight for us. And there were 6 different points on the peace treaty, and they honored that peace treaty. But it was a covenant between the Pilgrims and the Indians under God that they would do what they said they were going to do.
Interesting. So as the strangers, that's another part that you don't hear about a lot in school, right? Is the part about the strangers. You get this idea that everybody comes over and everybody believes exactly the same, and that's why they were able to get along so well. But that's not the case,
No, that isn't, no.
right? So what are the relations like between the strangers and the separatists, right? Once they're here and they're established, is there friction that happens there?
A little bit with some of them. I'll give you an example. A guy named John Billington came on the Mayflower, and he had 2 sons and his wife with him. And he was an somewhat of an arrogant person, and he didn't get along with the governor. He was always fighting with the governor. And what happened initially is when they pulled into Plymouth to Provincetown Harbor, the 2 sons, were playing in the hold of the Mayflower with gunpowder. They almost blew the boat up. So they
Oh,
come into Plymouth, and one of the 2 boys climbs a tree and looks out over the other direction. He saw a body of water, and he said, wow, we must be on an island. There's the sea. It wasn't the sea. It's the pond that feeds our river. So to torment the poor little kid for the rest of his life, they called the pond Billington Sea. We still call it that today. But also what happened is John Billington, his family survived completely for the first winter. And then he shoots a man over a land deal, and they hung him. So here he survives the whole family, and he goes and gets himself hung. And what happened is William Bradford would not conduct his trial because he didn't get along with him. He had Winthrop come down from Mass Bay. Winthrop tried him and found him guilty. But ironically, when they hung him on the same tree his son climbed to find Billington Sea.
wow.
So there was friction a little bit. Guy named Stephen Hopkins opened a bar in his house. That was illegal.
Right.
Yeah, but he also was the only person that went from England to Jamestown and came back and went from England to Plymouth. He took both trips. The only person that ever did that. Then there was a little book written about him called The Tempest by William Shakespeare. The Tempest
Interesting.
is about Stephen Hopkins. Stephen Hopkins,
Really?
Stephen Hopkins is Stefano because he took both trips and he got in the same kind of trouble in Jamestown that he did here in Plymouth. by starting a rebellion and pushing against the formal government.
Fascinating. So when they're trying to get along and form this community, are any of the strangers ever elected to positions like governor or mayor or anything like that? What is their standing next to the separatists?
Well, they all got along, and of course, if you didn't like Bradford being governor, you could vote him out. That's the beauty of having a civil government. And the election was every year. And William Bradford won the election. He was governor or assistant governor for 35 years in a row because he was good at what he did. He was gifted as a leader. So he kept getting revoted, but everybody got a vote. Not the women, but all the men got a vote. Even the male servants got a vote. So they were all treated equal that way, but it was a civil government. So whoever won the elections won it because everybody voted them in. So the thing was we had a governor and governor's assistants. That was the government. And they were elected every year. And even Miles Standish, the captain of the army, was elected. Because if you're going to have elections and self-rule, he was appointed originally, but now everybody gets elected, including him. But he kept getting reelected because he was good at what he did. So the people looked at it, and so we had to start getting along a little bit, and we did.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and it kind of assimilated into, like I said, when they went to church, they all went to church together. You didn't have to go to church. It was your choice. Life's full of choices. But if you're going to be in our congregation, you're going to be in Plymouth, you're going to live by our covenant, our biblical law. If you don't like it, you can leave. There was
Right.
yeah. So, and this is how we form denominations. Uh, if you come in and you don't like our church, go to Boston's church,
Right.
go by their rules, or go to Providence, Rhode Island. And so now we build these different denominations. So if you don't like the way we do it, that's okay. But if you're going to stay, you follow what we do. A guy named Roger Williams came into Boston and he told them how to run their church. You're not running your church right. I'm going to tell you how to run your church. They said, no, you're not. He said, yeah. He said, well, go. You're out. He came to Plymouth. Same thing. Civil government, what's the matter with you people? I'm going to show you how to run your church. Well, we kicked him out and he went and he founded Providence, Rhode Island, started his own church. Perfect. If you don't like our church, go to Roger's church. If you don't like his church, go to Boston. Now we have denominations and we have choices. And that's how things started building up around us with civil governments. And Roger Williams was instrumental in our relationship with the Indians. He really did a good job with the Indians.
Interesting. Let me ask you this, because this is something that's always fascinated me, is that because of when they live, they're relatively isolated from one another. But what are some of the differences between like Plymouth and then Jamestown, right? Because they both bear very different fruit.
Yeah, they do. It's a funny thing you should ask. A couple of years ago, I was invited to go speak in Virginia Beach at the first founding convention and the first founding down there because Jamestown came first and they founded it first. So they asked me to come speak. I'm speaking to 300 people, and I'm telling them the difference between Jamestown and Plymouth and Jamestown. So now I have to tell them how they did it wrong, which is kind of a tough place to be in. See, they went down there and they went there to strike it rich, and they had cannibalism. They had all kinds of odd things going on. They wouldn't work. They had people called gentry. Gentry refused to work. John Smith, the captain, says, "You don't work, you don't eat." And they said, "Okay, we won't eat." And they would starve to death before they would work. We came here as families. And when they went to Jamestown, they planted a cross and they planted the flag of England. They claimed Jamestown for England. When we came here, we planted a cross and we claimed Plymouth for families. We wanted nothing to do with England. So now we're building these little families and these little civil governments. And we start spreading out. And we start having all these tiny civil governments all run by their own towns. Then we got, we get Duxbury, we get Yarmouth, we get, and all these little towns all run their own government. So what the Pilgrims did is they taught the Indians how to form their own towns and run their own governments and elect their own people within the government. And we called those praying Indian towns. Natick was a praying Indian town. Martha's Vineyard was a praying Indian island, the whole island. So they formed their own governments and their own little civil government. So now what we're doing here is we're forming these little tiny civil governments where in Jamestown they claimed it for England. So now how do we get value from both of those? And there is value in both of those, even though I say they did a lot wrong. But they claim that for England. So now what we look at that and we say, okay, that will represent the federal government. They claim it for the federal government. We claim this as little towns and little individual civil governments, which today would represent the state government. So the value on both of them is you can look at Jamestown and said they formed what we call the federal government. We formed what is called the state government, the two governments coming together under the Constitution, and that's where our country is today.
Interesting. So they did ultimately end up kind of complementing one another, but it would take years before that could be fully fleshed out and understood.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah.
Ooh, that is fascinating. Okay, so with that in mind, then we've got kind of these parts and pieces out there floating around. So as they begin to take root and grow, and the it seems like at first things are very cohesive, right? You have essentially three different groups of people. You have the natives, you have the strangers, and you have the separatists, right?
Yeah.
And there's somewhat of some social cohesion, right? They may not always be hanging out together, but they've at least said, okay, this is what we're going to do. When things begin to break apart, is it due solely to the fact that that covenant skips a generation? Is that the catalyst for the whole thing, or is there other things that are involved that are kind of an outgrowth of that, Leo?
Well, there's two things. One thing is what you just said about the covenant. The other thing is as we grow and different people come in, now you have different issues that you have to deal with. You're not dealing with 100 people or 51 people. You're dealing with Boston. Thousands of people came in 1630. It was called the Great Migration. So now you have thousands of people coming in, all thinking a little differently. Now you have to deal with that, just like we did with Roger Williams. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with the people that are coming in to found Massachusetts Bay, which ended up being Boston? So as we grow out, we have different ideas and different pressures pulling together. But as they stayed together in Plymouth, I am, by the way, commonly asked for this point after that first winter, did the Pilgrims really have anything to do with the first Thanksgiving? And they did. See, that season they had a decent harvest, not great, but certainly enough food to get through the winter. They thought they ought to thank God for that. But not only that, they felt Massasoit was so instrumental in their survival, they should invite Massasoit and his immediate family to that celebration, and they did. Unfortunately, nobody explained to Massasoit the meaning of immediate family. He brought 90 braves. Well, there goes the food. But he did bring 5 deer, venison, turkey, fish, vegetables. They had enough food for a 3-day celebration where they honored one another and became better friends. So just that they would not forget what they had been through for the first course of that 3-day meal. Legend has it, Governor Bradford put a quarter-pound of cornbread on everybody's plate and asked everybody there to give him one thing they were thankful for that first year in Plymouth. And that was our first Thanksgiving. So we did assimilate with the natives, with the Indians, and with one another in those two different groups, and we assimilated into a strong community that, starting with 51 people, founded the country we have today. So when people say to me, I'm only one person, what can I do? 51 people started your nation as a Christian nation. There's always something you can do.
Ooh, that is that should be an invitation, right? And this is why I like having these conversations because, quite frankly, as people, we do this thing where we turn our historical figures and heroes into kind of marble statues,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And not that that's always bad. It's good to remember, right? We need to remember, but we need to remember fully. And one of the things we do is we kind of make gods out of these men to a certain degree in that we don't show their full humanity. We only show the good things that they did, right?
Right.
And that works to our detriment, I fear, more often than not, because we say, well, I could never be that good, right? I could never be that guy all the time. So I'm really disqualified from the work, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
But the truth is that you're only hearing about a portion of that man's life, right? You
Yeah.
don't see him every day and see his faults. God works with us despite that. And so to your point, that whole thing about I'm only one guy or it's only one family, that's enough, right? That's enough to start for a spark.
Of course. Yeah. Yeah. And you got a point. God uses me, and I have no idea why. I just don't know why he uses me. I haven't done this my whole life. I was a contractor. I didn't do this. But now I started studying it. And when I do things and I talk to people, things come out of my mouth and I say, where did that come from? That wasn't me. Where'd that come from? But I study a lot, and God puts these ideas in my head that are scripturally sound, biblically sound, and they work into the story. And it tells us how this story is is so good. And it's not because the people were great people, it's because they believed in God, and God was their king, and they followed God. So when they made mistakes, they reevaluated and they turned back again to God. And they kept the covenant. But as I just said, as we move and spread, people started breaking the covenant down, and they started removing God from his throne. And we got into chaos. And that's where we are today. We got to put God back in his throne. And we do it through the children, our kids. The parents should be those kids' heroes, because they'll teach them how to be a good civil servant and how to behave properly in this world. And that's where the heroes are. The heroes are in the family. That's the lesson with the Pilgrims. They came as families. That was their strength. Families under God. I- and good things happened because of that. And as where I sit here on the river at Plymouth, and I told you one side was Habermas Village, and on the other side was the plantation, and Habermas Village was occupied 3 years after the Pilgrims arrived. Not
Wow.
because they weren't here first, but what happened is we went to civil government, we changed everything we were producing, and then they had a drought for 2 months. Everything wilted. So on a Wednesday morning in July, 90 degrees, not a cloud in the sky, Governor Bradford turned to his people and he said, we need to get on our knees and we need to ask God what we've done wrong. And they began to pray. Noontime, not a cloud. 2 o'clock, nothing. 4 o'clock, a little cloud right above the plantation. And by 6 o'clock, it began to rain. And I do not mean the kind of rain we're used to here in Massachusetts, a nor'easter where everything gets knocked over, but a soft, gentle rain fell on Plymouth Plantation for 2 weeks, and the crops were saved. Somebody went up to the governor and said, hey, Governor, what'd you talk to God about? What'd you pray about? He said, well, you know what? Maybe, just maybe. We thought all of good results were us. We were no longer humble. And there was a visitor when that took place. That visitor's name, Hobbamock, the Indian chief. Hobbamock went up to the governor and says, you know what, Governor? I like your God. I just watch him save your crops. And Hobbamock became a Christian. And that is when 3 years after the Pilgrims arrived, he built his village across the river so he could be closer to his Christian friends and his Christian God. If I should shut the heavens so it will not rain, or command the locusts to devour the earth, or send pestilence amongst my people, and if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray, turn from their wicked ways and seek my face, then I will call on heaven, forgive their sins, and heal their land. It happened then. It can still happen today.
Leo, that is such an amazing story. And it really reminds me of something that happened in Mormonism. When the Mormons get out west, they plant their crops. And then the next thing you know, a swarm of crickets come in and are about to devour it.
Yeah.
And they got to hit their knees and they start praying immediately for relief. And seagulls begin to come in, eat every one of the crickets, and the crops are saved. Same sort of a premise, right?
Oh, yeah.
You got to hit your knees. You got to talk to your God if you want to be have those blessings of peace, prosperity, and protection.
That's right. And again, to your point, that's why these people are just people, but they follow God, and that's why they shine. So they did.
Right.
Bradford did not want attention brought to him. He did not want that. Leave me alone. I'm just a man. They offered to give him the plantation, name it after him, with a new covenant, with a new way of doing things, and he refused to do it. This is not mine. This is our country under God. I'm not the guy. God's the guy.
Ooh, we need some of that. All right. So I want to go because one of the geniuses of the American system is its economic machine, its economic principles.
Yeah.
When the pilgrims first touch ground, they don't necessarily think capitalism's the way to go, right? They start out with a different type of system. Is that correct?
It started out with a communal existence, with communism, socialism, but they were forced to do that by the people financing the trip. Bradford,
Right.
he knew it wouldn't work. So 3 years into the adventure, they went to capitalism. They all produced for themselves, and then each family produced, and whatever they had left over, they'd trade with each other, and the beginning of capitalism in our country. And but they knew that socialism wouldn't work. See, because they did everything under the Bible. And when I tell people they did Bible economics, they say to me, well, if they went for religious purposes, they couldn't have certainly gone for economic purposes. That doesn't mix. Of course it does. Economics is mentioned more in the Bible than any other subject. But the way they looked at it and the whole idea of who owns the land and all this, if you want to cut to the chase, to the creation, to the creator goes the creation. God created the land, and we're made in his image. And to be in his image here, now we're responsible for the land he created, which means we have to take care of his land. By the way, that doesn't mean just mow the lawn. It also means get involved with politics. We got to take care of his land. So what they would do is when they worked on their land, it wasn't to be profitable, really. It wasn't to make a lot of money. It was to worship God. Work is worship because God gave them that land, and their job was to produce the best they could off of that land to honor God. And if you do that, the economics, the profit comes later. But if you get up, start thinking, I'm going to do this just to make a profit, you're probably not going to be successful. And that's the way they did things. You ever heard of a guy named Rush Limbaugh?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Rush Limbaugh did what he did, but he never worried about making money. He worried about doing the best he could do, doing what he did. And when he passed away, he was making $42 million a year. But that was not his goal. His goal was to do the best he could with the talents God gave him. And that's what biblical economics is all about.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So when you said they had a communal system, what did that system look like? I mean, can you kind of give us an idea of what it was they were doing?
Yeah, they all worked a common field. And at the end of the season, they simply evenly split with each other what they produced. And of course, people go, that's fair enough, but it's not. Because what would happen if you and I went out in the field of work, you worked hard and I did not? I would still be paid what you were paid. There was no reward for hard work. 102 came, 51 died. The first 3 years, they all almost starved. Why? They didn't produce. There was no incentive. 1623, Governor Bradford changed to land ownership. Now every family owned their own land, grew their own food, and fed themselves. Then they simply traded with each other what they had left over. They tripled their production.
Interesting. So they gave I mean they gave it a real try and it just as we can expect now, right? I mean, socialism never pans out. It always ends up in starvation.
Right.
Um and so then Bradford has to step in and basically say, okay, we're going to do this a different way. Now, did that cause friction back in England because they're doing it differently than maybe what the investors had initially told them to do?
Of course, because now we're producing for ourselves. And why they did the communal existence is so the investors could get paid first and everything else that Pilgrims split with each other evenly. But that, obviously that didn't work. But the other side of the thing was for those 7 years, the investors were supposed to support the Pilgrims and they sent nothing. So the Pilgrims were self-sustaining economically, unlike Jamestown, who was supported by England. So
Mm,
we were beholden to nobody now because they didn't do what they said they were going to do. And but the Pilgrims, because they said they would, they paid back their debt. They
wow.
kept one common field and produced and sent that back to England. So they paid back their debt at 50% interest.
It's a steep price.
Yeah, yeah. But they said that, and they didn't have to do that because it was a business deal. If you and I went into business and you had an idea and I financed it at work, we'd both make money. If it didn't, we'd both lose money. End of conversation. That was a business deal. It went bad. They didn't have to pay that, but they did because they said
Right.
they would. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I want to go here real quick because I think this is, again, some place where you can really not just see God's fingerprints, you can see his whole hand moving here. Had the separatists wound up where they were initially aiming, would they have bumped into Squanto? Would they have bumped into Massasoit? I mean,
No,
because they were so instrumental, right?
no, no. They were headed to the Hudson River, which at that time was considered Northern Virginia. See, they had a patent to go to Virginia, but they could go to Virginia, but they wanted to be far enough away from Jamestown that they wouldn't be influenced by the Anglican Church. So they were going to where the Hudson River is today. That was Northern Virginia at the time. They missed it by 200 miles, ended up here, and had to write their own law. But had they landed there, no, they never would have met Squanto, Massasoit. None of that would have happened. And another funny thing is the Pawtuxet Indians were a hostile tribe that was wiped out by the plague. So if that plague didn't wipe out that tribe, the Pilgrims would have been killed.
Ooh, ooh,
So you see God's working in the whole thing. There's no doubt about
absolutely.
it.
Well, and I'm sitting here thinking if
Yeah.
they wind up in Northern Virginia, they don't even get an opportunity to write their own laws at that point,
That's
right?
correct.
Because
They
they're
still
in somebody else's territory.
they have to live under the patent of the king. But on the other hand, they landed in the wrong place. 102 people. They were driving the king crazy. He could care less. Ah, let them go. They're just going to die and go away. Unfortunately for the king, they started a country.
That, you know, every so often you get wind that the British monarchy just continues to shoot themselves in the foot. There's that, and there's a time when they decide to send people to the colonies to preach. Right? That's kind of another shoot themselves in the foot sort of a thing. But um, quick, you gotta go back anymore, right?
Yeah, I got to get moving on in a minute, but
Okay, real quick, Leo, if how do we right the ship now, right? Where do we go to find those original national covenants that were taken by the separatists, right? What documents can people look at to find those? Because I think we're in a time now where we have to really start reconsidering, do we make this covenant within families now, within churches? Is it time to reignite that?
yes, it is time to reignite that. That's where we need to be. And we do start it in the family with the covenant of the husband and wife getting married and under a covenant that they refuse to break. Now they're being an example to their children. This is the way you behave. Now let's get into the Bible and let's teach each other how biblical truths and biblical law and turn that back around. We're not going to do it from the government. We're going to change the country back to where it needs to be in the family. And that's the only way we're going to do it, which is exactly what the Pilgrims did. They came as families. That's why they were successful. Families under God. And we need to turn back to that one person at a time. And if we do that, that's the only hope, in my opinion, of getting back to the covenant where we were with the Pilgrims, where we need to be today.
100%. Leo, I won't keep you any longer. I know you're up against it. You're a busy guy. You're still leading tours and doing stuff that is just incredible. So I really appreciate you being here. I really, really do.
My pleasure. It's good to have it. I had a good time. Thank you.
Good. Real quick, if someone wanted to order something off of from your store, where do they go to do that? Are you guys online?
Yes, we are online. We are the Jenny Interpretive Center at info at the Jenny, Jenney.org. or www.thejenny.org. Either one of those will take you to our website. It will show you what we do, and we do have a bookstore on the website.
Fantastic. Well, Leo, again, I appreciate it. We'll have to do this again. I really enjoyed this. Thank you again for coming on.
My pleasure, and be happy to get together with you again.
Awesome, fantastic. All right, I'm going to go tell some folks about the monument to the forefathers, because that's the other thing that doesn't get enough attention.
Yeah,
So
okay. And you,
anyway,
in the meantime, have a wonderful Thanksgiving.
all right, thanks again, Leo. I really do appreciate it. Everybody else, I'm going to be coming right back, so hang tight. A few years back, I started to get the feeling that we, as fundamentalists and Orthodox Mormons, we need our own stuff. Up to now, we've been able to buy and purchase all of our scriptures, books, art, and music from other restoration organizations. And that's been good, but there's no guarantee it's going to remain that way. Also, it can be a bit tricky as you scour the internet trying to find all the books from your favorite fundamentalist or Orthodox Mormon authors. As I thought about this, I feel like I was really given a solution. Now, through the hard work of others, because let's face it, I'm the guy least qualified in all the world to build a website, I'm happy to present to you 1830mercantile.org. Right now on the website, you can see that we have all the books that have ever been written by 4 authors, including names like Drew Briney and Ogden Kraut. Also, very soon there will be a link to buy art and music, all produced by Mormons with a deep love for the restored gospel. There's also places for you to get free resources where you can find podcasts, videos, classes, and other presentations. Also, coming very soon, there will be a place for events where you can list the events from your organization so that you can get the most out of that attendance. Now, this can be as big as you want it to be. It's all up to you guys out there if you want to buy and post things on here. Now, if you're someone who produces something that you feel like others can benefit from, 1830 Mercantile is a place where you can make all of those products available for purchase. All you need to do is drop me an email at mormonrenegade@gmail.com and put 1830 in the title of that email with a short message, and either myself or someone else from the 1830 Mercantile team will reach out to you so we can get your product up there on the site. Now, to make sure that all the products that we offer are affordable and to ensure that the vast majority of the profits go to the producer, the website percentage is only 3 to 4% of the total cost. And that's just so I can pay the pros that have created this website and keep the lights on the website itself. Finally, by making some of your purchases at 1830mercantile.org, you will be supporting folks whose principles and morals are close, if not the same as yours, at the same time, not giving your money away to people who stand against everything you stand for. So, no matter if you're looking to make a purchase or you're a seller that wants to get your products listed, head on over to 1830mercantile.org today, drop me an email, and we'll make sure that we get back out to you. Now, back to the show. There's one other thing in Plymouth I want to go over with you, and it was something Amber and I visited while we were there in this fall in September, and that is a monument called the Forefathers Monument. Now, if you want to know more about this, because I'm just going to skim the tops of the mountains here, you can pick up this book. This is called Monumental Prayers. It's by a woman named Michelle Gallagher, and it goes into depth on what the monument means and what it's trying to convey. And I can't encourage you enough to get that book. It would make a great Christmas present, and you're going to get a lot from it. So I would absolutely encourage everyone to do that. You can pick up that book by going to Leo's website for the Jenny, which is his gift shop and museum, and you can order it from there and get it. And I'm sure you could get it by Christmas still if that's what you want to do. Again, that's called Monumental Prayers by Michelle Gallagher. All right, so let's go ahead and let's move on to the actual monument itself. So this is what's known as the Forefathers Monument. Okay, it is a massive monument. I think it stands 81 feet tall from top to bottom. It is a statue that has the lady here, and we're going to talk about her first, up top here. And then it's got smaller statues on the bottom. They're seated on pedestals. and each pedestal is a virtue. Now, on the side of each pedestal, there is a carving of um, kind of a smaller carving of other kind of adjacent virtues that go along with the other virtue that that's on the pedestal. So you kind of get the idea here. And we're going to go around, we're going to take a look at each one of them. Now, I can't encourage you enough to spend the time and go up there. It's 100% free to go. Once you get there, it sits on top of a hill that overlooks all of Plymouth Plantation. You can see clear out to the bay. It's a beautiful view. And if you got young kids and you want to teach them about America's founding, I can't recommend this enough. The monument itself, the original concept was in 1820. It ends up being dedicated in August of 1889, and it honors the ideals um, that would later be embraced by the United States that really their oh their inception to the Pilgrims themselves. And so I think there's a lot here we can take from this, both from the standpoint of how to be better citizens, but even better disciples of Jesus Christ. Because many of the things we're going to talk about, all the things we're going to talk about, you can find examples of in Scripture. And I'm going to point those out as well as we go along here. All right. So first is faith. She's the lady that stands up on top there. And she stands above all the other virtues, which I find interesting. But why do you think that is? Well, I think first we have to look at what it is the Pilgrims had to go through, both in their time in England, then as they go to Holland, and then as they make the boat ride and eventual plantation in Plymouth. In England, they are under horrible conditions. They're living in a time and a place where if you were caught reading an unsanctioned Bible, or if someone was even explaining to you what the Bible means who wasn't from the Church of England, you could absolutely be taken to prison. You could be executed. It was that serious of a crime. So their thoughts are, let's just pick up and move to Holland. And things are better in Holland, but they're by no means conducive for forming the kind of society and worshiping the way that the Pilgrims wanted to worship. So that makes them look towards the New World. So they secure financing. They rent two boats. One boat has way too many problems, right? Keeps taking on water. They got to turn around. Everybody climbs aboard the Mayflower. They come over in horrible conditions. Look, they crammed you down in the hold, right? And so you're just down there and you're being tossed about as storms come. When you need to use the restroom, it's in a bucket. Like the food is tainted. It's not a great time. They get to Plymouth and it's not like they're rolling into town, right? There's nothing there. So they embark in December, right? I don't know if you've ever visited the Northeast in December. It is cold, wet, and miserable. It is not great. And through this all, they maintain a relatively happy disposition. In fact, Bradford even talks about it a little bit. And he says this: born their sad afflictions with as much patience and contentedness as I think any people could do, but it was the Lord who upheld them. So what made them do it? What made them stick it out, right? They could have jumped back on the Mayflower and went home, and they didn't. That first winter, over half the colony dies. Out of 118 people, only 51 survived that first winter. And so they had the opportunity after that first winter to board the boat and go home, but they didn't. They stayed. Why? Well, faith plays such a massive component here. Faith is forever tied to hope. If you have faith, you have hope. And hope can pull you through a lot of things. But faith is even more stronger than that because it allows you to know that there is a God and He has a plan and that you're not just left to your own devices if you walk up to the things that you're supposed to do. So they can have faith in that and say, you know what? You're right. This does stink right now, but we're on to something bigger and better, and we need to stick this through. And it's through their faith that they're able to endure all of these things and not just endure it, but endure it well to the point that they're still instruments in God's hands to use. I want to read you Matthew 6, verse 25 and 26. Speaks a lot about faith. says, therefore I say unto you, take no thought for your life, what ye shall eat, or what ye shall drink, nor for your body, what ye shall put on them. Is not life more than meat, and the body more than raiment? Behold, the fowls of the air, for they sow, for they sow not, neither do they reap, nor gather into barns. Yet your heavenly Father feedeth them. Are ye not much better than they? Sometimes I think we don't fulfill whatever mission our Lord gives us because we don't have the faith necessary, or we're scared, right? Being scared is normal. Being nervous about things, that's normal. But it's that faith and that hope that allows us to stare the scary things in the face, to just stare them down and say, you know what? It's scary, but I'm going to do it anyway. And the Pilgrims absolutely do this. They're able to do this despite that fear. Look, they're leaving the only place they've ever known, going to a foreign land, not sure what to expect when they get there from the natives, not sure what to grow when they get there, but they're doing it anyway. Because they had faith, they had hope. And because they had faith, they could stare the fear in the face and say, we're going to do it no matter what. Okay, that takes us to the first pedestal now. Okay, the first one is morality. And there is so much here to unpack. I can't wait for this part of it. The Pilgrims' experience in Holland, it wasn't horrible, but it wasn't right either. So they get out of England, right, which had to be a huge relief because now you don't got to worry about going to jail. Holland was like, look, we don't care what you believe. We don't care how you practice. As long as you're not infringing on the rights of others, you're good. So they go to Holland and they end up really being kind of embraced, right? They develop very quickly a reputation as a people who was industrious, who was willing to work and work hard. And so finding jobs wasn't a problem. And as they get there, they're destitute. And so the people in Holland, the shopkeepers, they take a chance on them. They extend them credit. Well, they're better paying than a lot of the locals from Holland. And so they develop this reputation of they're going to pay you no matter what if they owe that to you. And so they develop a really good rapport, but yet there were some things there that just weren't quite right, that they couldn't make it work. But nonetheless, they cultivated this reputation of being a very moral people. Again, Bradford says this: they endeavored to show a rare example of brotherly and Christian care. This is when they're in Holland, right? And they even make some converts while they're there because of the example that they set and how they treat other people. Bradford would also go on to say this: in the first 3 decades, excuse me, this isn't Bradford. This is a guy named Bartlett who wrote a book called The Faith of the Pilgrims, and he says, in the first 3 decades of Plymouth, no stranger was turned away, and the plantation endeavored to extend hospitality to those who came seeking a haven. So if you were someone who was cast out of English society or whatnot, and you went to the New World and you encountered the Pilgrims, they were going to do everything that they could to take care of you. They had a moral compass that would not allow you to go hungry or unsheltered. They were there, and they were there because, quite frankly, I think they remembered what they were coming from as well. But also, this is who they are, right? They try to live everything they read from the Bible to the best of their abilities, to be able to be the people that exude Christ-like love and Christ-like morality. This is a quote from John Adams, almost 200 years uh, down the road from the Pilgrims. But he has this to say when he's talking about the Constitution. He says, we have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. If we want to enjoy liberty, if we want freedom, we have to be willing to govern ourselves, right? We have to be able to have a king, right? Now, hear me out. If you're going to take away the earthly king, there's got to be an authority that steps in. The Pilgrims understood that that was God, that you didn't need an earthly king, that you could have God and he could lay forth your morality. And in order for the Constitution of the United States to work, we have to be, as Adams put it, a moral and religious people. Look, I don't care what anybody says, all people are religious. Every one of them. It's just a matter about who you're going to make your God. Is your God going to be the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Or is your God going to be leisure and comfort? Is it going to be the environment? Is it going to be government? What is it? But every person is religious by nature. And I think that Adams recognizes this, and that's why he's saying it. And Adams, he's basically saying this government is suited to America. Why? Because during this time, I believe it's many of these principles here that we're going to go over, they've been instilled down to that day by their pilgrim forebears. Here is Mosiah chapter 2, verse 17. And behold, I tell you these things, that ye may learn wisdom, that ye may learn that when ye are in the service of your fellow beings, you are only in the service of your God. Again, once you have morality, you stop looking inward as much and you start looking outward to bless other people. That is the mark of true discipleship as well. Now, on the side of the pedestal, on one of the sides of the pedestal of morality is the evangelist. Evangelist is equal to proclaiming the gospel. Okay. The pilgrims understood that there was a commission that they had to use, right? And it's laid out in scripture. We're going to cover a few of those verses that they needed to continue to try to further the kingdom of God. And they do this. In 1653, a Puritan minister named John Eliot hoped to better evangelize the native population by presenting the gospel in their native tongue. For 8 painstaking years, Eliot worked with linguists and translators to produce a translation of the Bible in the Algonquin language. In time, there would be whole towns of Native Americans who would convert to Christianity. They were known as the praying Indian communities. And as you can see by their example, they understood that just because you're in a new place, that doesn't relieve you of the commission to further the kingdom and proclaiming the gospel. Matthew 28:29, the Savior says, Go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost. Then staying with this theme in Doctrine and Covenants, section 28, verse 8, it says, And now behold, I say unto you, that ye shall go unto the Lamanites and preach my gospel unto them. And inasmuch as they receive thy teachings, thou shalt cause my church to be established among them. Okay? Very clear here. This is an interesting parallel. The pilgrims get there and they immediately start talking about the gospel. The church is organized and immediately missionaries go out to the Native Americans. This is not an accident. I believe that they may not have had the knowledge to back it up, but the pilgrims understood that every soul had its worth. They didn't understand that these were actually people, the descendants of people from the Middle East, but yet they still felt that calling. Likewise, as soon as the church is established, the first thing the Lord has Joseph do is send missionaries to the natives. Fascinating parallel. This is where it really gets interesting. On the other side of the pedestal is the prophet. Okay, as you can see here, he's holding the Decalogue. He's looking towards heaven, proclaiming things. The pilgrims were they operated with an understanding that anybody could be a prophet, right? If you could call to repentance, you were acting in the prophet's role. They also understood that people would receive revelation and that they would begin to be able to expound the scriptures. And so this idea of prophecy here, it ties in real heavily with 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 the pilgrim's mission of coming to America. Likewise, there's a great scripture, we've read it 1,000 times. Surely the Lord God will do nothing, but he revealeth his secret unto his servants the prophets. Okay. We should seek to cultivate that in our own lives, that gift of prophecy, because it's so vitally needed to our walk here. And this is a good place to go back a little bit. Let me go back here for just a second. If you look at morality, she's holding two things. In her left hand, she's holding the law, right? The Decalogue stone. Here in her right hand, she's holding a scroll. Well, I did some research to try to figure out what that scroll was. And what I found was that it's a scroll of revelation. Okay. So to be a truly moral people, you're going to need revelation. You're not going to be able just to have the law and think that that is it. We are not a sola scriptura people. We are a people who believe that revelation is needed. And from time to time, prophetic gifts are handed out. Even to a guy like me, I want to give you a story here to show you how this might work. This was shortly after Amber and I were first married, and I had went to the temple that morning, and Amber and her mom were going to go to the mall in Boise and do some shopping. And so the plan was is I would just meet up with them. Well, I got done with my session and I parked my car and I got out, and Amber and her mom were just pulling in. So I mean it was perfect timing. And as we're walking into the store, into the mall there, I walked past this van. And the van has tinted windows, but I could see a gentleman leaning up against the window. And he was pale. I couldn't see that he was pale. He looked normal, but his I found out later it was his daughter. She was in the driver's seat, and she was just kind of talking on her phone. And so I just assumed that guy was sleeping. And I took about two steps past his door, and I got a very distinct message: "Go open that door." Now I thought, I'm not opening that door. That's a carjacking. But I took two more steps, and the spirit hit so strong. And it was so unmistakable. Go open that door. And I remember I just stopped. And it was the weirdest experience. It felt like I had tunnel vision. And I remember Amber's mom stopped and she looked at me and she said, "Are you okay?" And I said, I just kind of shook my head and I turned back around and I opened the door of that car. And as I opened the door, this man comes spilling out. And he's a big guy. And so I catch him. And as he unfolds, he takes this great big deep breath and he starts breathing. But I noticed that he was pale. His lips were blue. He lost control of his bowels. I mean, he was in bad state. But because he was facing away from his daughter, she couldn't see him. And so she, looks at me and it probably thought it was a carjacking. But as I'm holding her dad and she looks at her dad, she can see that something's wrong. She hangs up, dials 911. The paramedics get there, and me and Amber and her mom go off into the mall. But here's what I'm saying is that there are going to be times where prophecy in your own life is going to be necessary, where you're going to have to be open to receiving the messages that God has for you, and sometimes relay those to others, and sometimes act on those. But nonetheless, prophecy is absolutely needed in our day here and to fulfill these missions. America itself was looked at as a land of promise, and the Pilgrims expected that prophecy was going to be a part of it. Now, speaking of prophecy, I want to talk about Thomas Jefferson here for a minute. Before we get into anything too groundbreaking, I want to say this. Jefferson, he understands the assignment. He knows what's wrong, right? And it's evidenced by this quote here. He says, "I hold the precepts of Jesus as delivered by himself to be the most pure, benevolent, and sublime which have ever been preached to man. I adhere to principles of the first age and consider all subsequent innovations as corruptions of religion, having no foundation in what came from him." Okay. So what he's saying here is he's like, look, by this point in time, 1800 years after the birth of the Savior, we've lost a ton, and there has been a ton that has been corrupted. Jefferson understood the problem at hand when it came to religion. But Jefferson would go on to make a prophecy, and I find this really fascinating. Here's what he says. If the freedom of religion guaranteed to us by law in theory can ever rise in practice, truth will prevail over fanaticism, and the genuine doctrines of Jesus, so long perverted by pseudo priests, will again be restored to their original purity, but it's too late for me. And he was right. Jefferson would not get to witness the restoration. But nonetheless, something in him, the Spirit whispers to him, once freedom of religion is established, there will be a restoration. So what was he referring to? Obviously, he's referring to Joseph Smith and the things that he restored. That is what he was referring to. So America, again, a land of prophecy. Okay, moving on. John Winthrop, the City on the Hill speech / prophecy and covenant is a big part. I'm going to read you a portion of it right now. Pay attention. Pick out the parts where he's making a prophecy. He says, "The Lord will be our God and delight to dwell amongst us as his own people, and will command a blessing upon us in all our ways, so that we shall see much more of his wisdom, power, goodness, and truth than formerly we have been acquainted with. When we shall find that the God of Israel is amongst us, when 10 of us shall be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies, when he shall make us a praise and a glory that men shall say of succeeding plantations, may the Lord make it like that of New England." Okay, so here it is. The Lord will be our God and delight to dwell amongst us. Okay, that he shall show unto us more of his wisdom, power, and goodness and truth, and that 10 of us will be able to withstand 1,000 of our enemies. So the question is, did it happen? First, we have the Revolutionary War. Look, we were vastly outnumbered. I'm not sure what the ratio was, but we were outnumbered. England is the superpower of the day, the biggest army, the biggest navy, best trained, best supplied, you name it, and way more British regulars than there are American colonists. But nonetheless, the victory is had. That picture down at the bottom there, that's one of my favorite pictures of the Revolution. And that is in Yorktown when Washington strikes the deciding blow in the Revolution. There was a few more battles after this, but everybody knew at that time that whoever won in Yorktown was most likely going to win it altogether. And he forces Cornwallis to surrender. Now, Cornwallis, he's beside himself that he's been beat by farmers and blacksmiths and essentially what he terms as colonial rabble, right? These were the backwoods guys that weren't sophisticated, yet they beat the best army and navy in the world at that day. And he's so humiliated that he can't even bring himself to surrender his own sword. He feigns an illness and then sends one of his lackeys to do it. So how about that part of so that's one part of the prophecy that Winthrop made that is absolutely checked off. What about that part about the God of Israel dwelling amongst us? Well, certainly we have two for sure accounts, right? The Lord showing up to Joseph Smith in the sacred grove, and then the Lord showing up again in the Kirtland Temple. So that's a check. What about imparting unto us way more of his wisdom, knowledge, truth, and goodness? Again, that is a yes. As Joseph Smith restores truth, mankind sees much more of his knowledge and truth and wisdom than ever before. It absolutely happened. Okay, that takes us to the law. Now, despite being in the minority, the Pilgrims were the only passengers aboard the Mayflower with any experience in self-governance. They drafted a new agreement to replace their old land patent. Each signer of the new compact swore an oath, swore an oath before God and each other, pledging to submit to all duly elected leaders and laws of their new settlement, which would be enacted for the good of everyone. Notice they didn't just say, we're just going to obey any law. They said only that law which is good for everyone. The Pilgrims recognized that it was only through the establishment of law that liberty could be found. We need to parse out some words here. Freedom and liberty. Those are two different things. So often we use them interchangeably, and they can be, but I don't think they necessarily are the same things, right? You can live in a state of anarchy and say you have maximum freedom, but not really. And let me explain why. You might have the max amount of freedom to do whatever it is you want to do, but there is nothing to safeguard all the things you worked for being taken from you. That's not liberty. That might be ultimate freedom, but that's not liberty. You only have liberty once you have a nation of laws. And that's because you now have the freedom to go to work and buy land, buy a home, buy a car, whatever it is, right? You buy. That's your stuff. You worked for it. And now you have the liberty to enjoy it because of law, right? We know that with law, there come restraints against doing things that are detrimental to people and societies. The Pilgrims also had a view of law that was unique. They didn't look at it as coming from a king. They looked at it as coming from God. And this is evidenced in the fact that they quoted a lot from Isaiah, specifically Isaiah chapter 9, where it says, "For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder. Of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end, upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, to order it and to establish it with judgment and with justice from henceforth, even forever." Okay. They viewed Christ as their king. And that's who we should view as our king, is Christ himself. Christ's laws are there as very civilizing laws, right? Preventing anarchy. This is D&C 134 verses 1 through 2. It says, "We believe that governments were instituted of God for the benefit of man, and that he holds men accountable for their acts in relation to them, both in making laws and administering them, for the good and safety of society. We believe that no government can exist in peace except such laws are framed and held inviolate as will secure to each individual the free exercise of conscience, the right and control of property, and the protection of life." Through their letter here in D&C 134, early leaders of the church are echoing the same thing that the Pilgrims did. It's of divine nature, that laws are there to make sure that man can have liberty and that freedom is protected for mankind. That is the purpose of government. That takes us to one of the side panels on the pedestal of law, and that is justice. Societies can only function if justice is enforced. As we see today, when we get the feeling like justice isn't done, what happens? Well, it begins to grate on society, and it causes society to fray at the ends, and it begins to become undone. And why is this? It's because if you live in a society without justice, again, you can't count on being able to work for something and keep it. It can be taken from you. And so it requires justice to be done. I want to talk about a guy named Arthur Peach. So forgive me, I couldn't find where he came from, if he was on the original boat with the Pilgrims or if he comes over later. But regardless, um, Arthur Peach is a pretty rough guy, a drunkard. He constantly getting in people's faces and causing fights. I mean, he's just not a good guy. And as tends to be the case, he attracts others that are kind of his same ilk. And they form a band, and they're suspected of stealing stuff all the time. It can never be proven, but nonetheless, it's going on. One day they're hanging out in the forest, uh, Peach and his band of miscreants, I guess, and they see a couple of Native Americans coming back from Plymouth. They'd been there trading, right? And so they're coming back with some goods. And Peach and his men decide that, you know what, they want that stuff. And so they're going to take it from this Indian. So they grab the guy who's carrying everything. The other Indian, he takes off for the hills, and they take this Indian stuff, but in the process of doing it, they beat him to death. I mean, it is horrific. And so this Indian that escaped, he comes back and says what happened. And look, the Pilgrims weren't about that. And so they immediately get a warrant, they arrest him and his whole band, and they put him on trial. They find him guilty and they kill him. They execute him by hanging. And this is what Bradford has to say about it. Some of the Indians were present for the execution, and as Bradford would put it, afterwards, it gave all the country satisfaction. However, there was sadness for the loss of life. Okay. They were sad to see life being extinguished, but they were happy and satisfied that justice had been done. Why? Because all the wrongs had been righted. And the other thing is it showed that the law would apply to everybody equally. It didn't matter who you were. There were a couple that Bradford mentions that were kind of upset that an Englishman would be put to death because of what he did to an American. But the Pilgrims understood that justice can only work when justice is equal. Okay. Quoting now from Alma chapter 42, verse 25. What do you suppose, that mercy can rob justice? I say unto you, nay, not one whit. If so, God would cease to be God. So even God, through Alma, is telling you, I would cease to be God if I did not allow justice to prevail. Justice is an eternal principle. All the scales must be balanced in the end, or he ceases to be God. Now, this next scripture is really going to apply to us today. This is Leviticus chapter 19, verses 15. It says, Ye shall do no unrighteousness in judgment. Thou shalt not respect the person of the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty, but in righteousness thou shalt judge thy neighbor. If we go back to what some of those other men wanted, right? They were mad that an Englishman was going to be put to death for murdering an Indian. What he's advocating for is a tiered justice system. Now, when we see this today, it sticks in our craw, right? When we see politicians blatantly breaking the law and do things that, quite frankly, you and I would be put in jail for, and there's no justice, that causes a society to decay within, because you can no longer have trust in your institutions. And when there's no trust in institutions, you're left to your own devices. And so having a tiered justice system does not work. Justice must be equal across the board. And that's what the Lord is telling us in Leviticus. Now, this brings us to mercy. The Pilgrims endeavored to live every principle of righteousness, including mercy. They understood that mercy was just as important as justice. Sometimes mercy, given the circumstances, you're going to need to have justice there, so that, mercy there to temper justice. Sometimes there are extenuating circumstances. I think of what happened with Joseph Smith with his horse, right? His horse was stole. They catch the guy who stole it and they put him on trial. He's fined, and then he pays for the horse that he stole. He pays the fine. Upon walking out, Joseph hands the man his horse and says, Now you can go get your family. Joseph instituted both justice and mercy there. And that's what we're called to do in this world. Another great example of this is the Mayflower. So when the Mayflower gets to Plymouth, it's December, right? And a lot of the Pilgrims were sick. Bad sick. Probably had a little bit of scurvy, dysentery, we know. Look, I kind of painted the picture for you, right? When you're on this boat, you use the restroom in a bucket, right? Well, think about what's going to happen to that bucket as the ship rocks back and forth in some of those winter storms. It's going to get everywhere, right? The water's tainted, the food isn't great. They're in a world of hurt. They get to the New World, and immediately the captain's like, get off the boat, right? These guys are super sick, and they got sick before they got there. And the captain is like, put them in quarantine. Don't let them anywhere near anyone else. That kind of makes sense, right? I get that. But at some point, one pilgrim makes his way up onto the deck, and he's begging for just a small drink of beer. And beer was really a staple back then because, unlike water, it wouldn't contaminate as quickly. But the guy that's laying on the deck, he reaches up begging for some beer. And one of the ship hands just looks at him and says, I'm not wasting good beer on you. You can die like a dog. His exact words. So eventually the ship's captain just says, you know what? Get the Pilgrims off the boat. We don't want them here. They're sick. Get them off the boat. So they're forced to leave the boat, right? They take the smaller boat, they row to the mainland. There's no shelter there, right? So the guys who are healthy, they have to start going to work making shelters, and they do. And then they end up, shooting some game, finding some corn, and people start getting nursed back to health. Meanwhile, on the Mayflower, the rest of the deckhands like get sick almost immediately, and all of them start succumbing to this. At this point, the ship's captain says, "You know what? Go ahead and let the pilgrims back on the boat. They can sleep here at night. Everyone's sick anyway." So the pilgrims get back on the boat, and they don't just go down there to sleep. What do? They immediately start tending to the sick crew members on the boat. And in fact, the man who said you could die like a dog for all I care, he's sick and he ends up dying. But before he dies, there's an interesting exchange that happens between him and one of the pilgrims. As they're nursing him back, trying to nurse him to health, he basically says, "I am ashamed right now in taking charity from you because I showed you none." Look, for me, I hope I would be that guy, but I also know I have the inclination to be like, "Look, dude, you showed me no love, right? Wallow in your own pity. I want no part of it." I hope I would be more like the pilgrims because they showed him mercy even when they showed them none. Third Nephi chapter 12 verse 7. And blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. I think one of the reasons the pilgrims were able to be merciful is that they understood that they too were beggars at the bar of God. They understood that they fell short. And if they wanted mercy, the Lord told them that if you're going to get mercy, you need to extend mercy. And we need to put that in our own quiver, so to speak. Look, it's real easy for us to tell people, "I told you so." And I think there's going to be a lot of reason to tell people, "I told you so" later. But we can't do it. As people realize they've made mistakes, maybe it's a wayward child that comes back to the church or comes back to the gospel. Maybe it's someone that you've warned about doing, warn someone, "Hey, you're doing something that's going to hurt you," and they did it. And you're going to want to tell them, "I told you so." Don't do it. Just show mercy. Because as you show mercy, you then now have the opportunity to have a relationship with that person and exercise a righteous example to them. Okay, that brings us to the pedestal of education. For the pilgrims, education wasn't, it was a family affair, right? Despite what the experts say, the pilgrims are our example that not only are you able, but you're uniquely qualified to teach your own children. They had the model of homeschooling, or they would send their kids to different homes where somebody else was better suited to teach on a specific subject. Nonetheless, there wasn't public school like we have it now. A guy named Lawrence Kremen, who wrote a book called American Education, talked about the colonial experience here concerning education. He said they instructed their children in the principles of religion, good manners, and civil behavior, to instill in them reverence for their elders and superiors, to bring them up in some lawful and gainful calling, to teach them to read and write both for worldly and spiritual ends. Okay? Again, the pilgrims knew how to do it. Now, we've read several scriptures before about educating children, right? There's the one in Proverbs 22 verse 6. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. That one's huge. I knew a lot of guys who thought their children would learn the gospel by osmosis, right? That they would just stick them in church or they would stick them around other religious kids and they'd pick it up. Well, you know what? That doesn't work. It can definitely help to strengthen, but they need to hear it from the parents about training them up in the ways of God. It's going to be your example as parents. It's going to be your words as parents that will instill in them their testimonies. And then Doctrine and Covenants, section 118, verse 88. And as all have not faith, seek ye diligently and teach one another words of wisdom. Yea, seek ye out of the best books, words of wisdom. Seek learning, even by study and also by faith. Okay. This, I think, speaks to something important when we talk about education. The world would have you believe that there's no way to become educated other than by playing their game of going to college and getting the degree. That is not education. You can get educated along the way, but that's not true education. So often it's about memorization of facts. Okay. You can educate yourself outside of college, and you can do that by reading the best books you can get your hands on as you get interested in a subject. You don't have to play the game that academia wants you to play. You can become educated on your own. Our founders, many of the world's best and brightest today, are self taught men. And that's because when you read primary sources rather than somebody's interpretation of it, you can pick up a lot different things, more correct things, I should add. So, on one side of the education pedestal, there's wisdom. Now, wisdom is different from education. I think one of the ways education could be described as the collecting of knowledge. If that's true, then wisdom is the correct and practical application of that knowledge. Okay. Never before have we had the opportunity to have so much knowledge at our fingertips. The phone that's in your pocket has more computing power than the first computer that landed the man on the moon. Okay. You can find anything you want with a few minutes of typing. You can find anything to become educated on things. You can go to YouTube. There's a lot of great things on YouTube on how to do stuff. You can you can collect information all day long. Okay? But wisdom is the correct and practical application of that knowledge. There are primarily two ways that you can gain wisdom. The way that it's most usually done is at the hands of a mentor. William Bradford definitely learned his knowledge from this way. Bradford was probably the most successful and longest acting governor there in Plymouth. But he learned things. He was quite a bit younger than some of the other leaders there. He learned at Pastor John Robinson's feet, Brewster's feet, Carver's feet. Because he learned by their example and that they were good men, his time in as governor was just, it was not only was it long, it was probably perhaps the most productive administration of any governor ever. I mean, it was amazing. And he did it because he was able to learn wisdom from those other men. There's a scripture here that I love, and it's from Proverbs chapter 23, verses 3 through 4. And it says, through wisdom is a house built, and by understanding it is established, and by knowledge shall the chambers be filled with all precious and pleasant riches. Okay. So knowledge only becomes precious and pleasant riches when they're housed in wisdom. That's the only way knowledge and education become riches. Why is that? Well, I think we can look at it a couple different ways. First, let's look at the negative ways that education could be used. If we look at World War II Germany, Nazi Germany, there was no doubt that the Germans have always been known for their engineering prowess. But what they use it for? They used it for killing. They created probably the most prolific and well-oiled killing machine the world has ever seen. Not exactly wisdom. Now, let's look at something that happened during COVID. If you remember correctly, early on, and it ended up being a mistake, I want to say that the call went out that they needed ventilators. All of a sudden, private business dropped what they were doing and started um, making ventilators. They stopped making vacuums, all that other thing, and started making ventilators. Okay. That is knowledge housed in wisdom, and it became a treasure. And then the second way is as Joseph Smith did. He asked God, James 1:5, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God that giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. God is the ultimate giver of wisdom. And the more godly we can become, the more wise we can become. And that means that we have to do a better job in our discipleship, learning more about him and getting closer to him. On the other side of the education pedestal is youth. The Pilgrims understood the importance of God's design for the family unit to forge and preserve future generations. I alluded that Holland didn't work out quite right for the Pilgrims, and I'm going to tell you why. The Pilgrims came in there, and Holland, even though it's not exactly what it is today, it was still kind of cosmopolitan and a little more morally liberal than what the Pilgrims were. And what started to happen is that their kids started to see that, and they started to leave the faith. And that was one of the big driving reasons why they felt like it was important to leave Holland, so that they wouldn't be losing their kids spiritually to the world. Today, we're kind of in a similar boat. We must protect and guard our children. In today's climate, we don't normally have to worry about hostile Indians, bears, or dying of some weird disease like the Pilgrims did. We do, however, have to worry about insidious people trying to instill in our children ideas that lead to death and despair, right? I'm thinking of all the trans stuff in schools now, and the LGBTQ stuff, right? That's not something your kids should be learning about from anyone other than you. And so we have people who are trying to set the agenda to take our kids out of faith. And we have to be on guard for that. And we have to look back towards the Pilgrims' example if we want to be able to raise up the future generation in a moral and godly way. 3 Nephi chapter 17, verse 21. And when he had said these words, he wept, and the multitude bare record of it. And he took their children, or took their little children one by one, and blessed them and prayed unto the Father for them. If the Savior of all mankind can take time to bless children, are we blessing our own children in our homes? Are we praying over them? Are we doing the things necessary to protect them as we send them out into the world? Another scripture here is the one where the Lord says this, and whoso shall offend one of these little ones that believe in me, it is better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck and he were cast into the sea. Okay, that takes us to the pedestal of liberty. When the Pilgrims were getting ready to leave for the New World, they secured financing through investors in London. The Pilgrims agreed to share the colony's profits until the debt was paid. For 3 years, the Pilgrims operated a communal economy. However, in every one of the years after the first, production went down year after year. As Bradford and other leaders in the colony tried to figure out what was going on, what they were seeing is that they were running a communal system. And because of that communal system, some would work really hard and some not so much, just the bare minimum. But it didn't matter because you all got the same amount, right? Well, that was a problem. And so what the leadership does there in Plymouth is they decide, okay, we're going to go to a more private kind of system, right? More of a free market system. So if somebody produces more, they get to keep more, right? And after that, the colony really begins to thrive. And I could have swore I read this. I can't find it again. But if I'm not mistaken, they ended up paying off their debts back to the investors in London early once they established that new system. Okay. The Pilgrims would also establish other liberties, perhaps the most important of which was religious liberty. Given what the Pilgrims had to endure to practice their faith in the old world, it's little wonder why the Lord would wait to start the restoration until America had her religious liberties in place. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 17. And where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Gandhi had something really interesting to say about the New Testament. He said that book is a book of revolution through peaceful, nonviolent resistance. Okay? Anytime a society espouses the principles laid out by the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you can bet that the next thing to fall will be a thirst for freedom. And we see that here. Moving on to Leviticus chapter 25, verse 10. And proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto the inhabitants thereof. Interestingly enough, that scripture is on the front of the Liberty Bell. You cannot worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and then not seek liberty. There's something there that is intrinsically connected that requires each to come to full fruition. D&C 134, verse 2. We believe that no government can exist in place except such laws are framed and held inviolate as will secure each individual the free exercise of conscience, the right and control of property, and the protection of life. Again, spelling out those two liberties that men want. Freedom of conscience, to be able to worship God as you see fit, and the freedom to hold land, to be able to have it under your control and to prosper yourself, not have your stuff stolen. That's what government is there for. That is where liberty resides. Moving on to D&C 134, verse 4. We believe that religion is instituted of God and that men are amenable to him and to him only for their exercise of it, unless their religious opinions prompt them to infringe upon the rights and liberties of others. But we do not believe that human law has a right to interfere in prescribing rules of worship, to bind the consciences of men, nor dictate forms for public or private devotion. That the civil magistrate should restrain crime, but never control conscience, should punish guilt, but never suppress freedom of the soul. On one side of the panel is the defeat of tyranny. The Pilgrims were well acquainted with tyranny. William Bradford described it this way. They were hunted and persecuted on every side until their former afflictions were but as flea bitings in comparison. Some were clapped in prison, others had their houses watched day and night and escaped with difficulty, and most were obliged to fly and leave their homes and livelihood. That's horrible conditions, right? Having your house watched day and night. They knew what tyranny was. To assure a different outcome in Plymouth, the Pilgrims were admonished by Pastor John Robinson, and he's a fascinating guy too. You should study up on him. He's a guy who never makes the boat ride over, dies in the old world, but nonetheless continues to counsel with these folks as they come across. Anyway, Pastor John Robinson admonished them to create a new ruling charter. Think of it kind of like a proto-constitution that would hold the governed and those governing to the same standard and elect wise and noble leaders to ultimate leaders. The ultimate realization of liberty wouldn't be realized until after America's revolutionary period, but they gave it a real good start here in Plymouth. And they were very cognizant that we had to elect righteous men to fill these positions of power. They didn't have to agree with them religiously, but they did have to be men of moral character if they wanted the government to function as it should. So they understood that tyranny was a problem and that men are disposed to it. And so it would take good laws and good men to fill the seats of power to make sure that tyranny wasn't established in the New World. That brings us to the final one, which is peace. Now, we could certainly see how learning and living these principles can establish peace. However, I think given what the Pilgrims went through, we have to conclude that even in their afflictions, they had a sense of peace. Here's an example. I talked about him a little bit. William Brewster, he was an elder in that congregation and had a lot of influence over William Bradford. And when he passes, Bradford has something to say at his funeral. He stands and he said, I would ask, was he, meaning Brewster, worse for any of his former sufferings? I say nay. He was surely the better, for now they are added to his honor. They were added to his honor. I think if we want to hear the words on the other side, well done, thou good and faithful servant, we are going to have to endure some things. We're going to have to go through some trials, but at the end, it'll be counted for our good, and it will help to mature us spiritually. And they understood this about peace, right? True peace isn't the absence of struggle. True peace is found with God, even in the middle of struggle. The Pilgrims understood this suffering. They understood it was inevitable. It was an inevitable mark of a well lived life. And having peace in spite of those struggles through the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's the kind of peace I believe the Pilgrims were talking about. So, what now? Come this Thursday, many, if not all of us, will have the opportunity to sit down with either friends or family or both and enjoy a great meal together, to have our families near us, and to just spend time with them. We may even watch a football game or two, or in my case, probably four. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with those things. You should enjoy this time with your families. Thanksgiving's been always one of my favorite holidays because there's no frills, there's no having to rush around and buy stuff. It's just food and family. So you should enjoy that. But I would say this, maybe it's time in our own lives, privately or with your family, to renew some of those covenants that the Pilgrims made. So I sat and I thought about which covenant I thought me and my family would benefit most from this year. And it's this one by John Winthrop. And I quoted from a little piece of it earlier. But I'm going to give you not quite the full thing, but the bulk of it here. And this is what he says in the City on the Hill speech. He says, "Now, the only way to avoid this shipwreck and to provide for our posterity is to follow the counsel of Micah, to do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. For this end, we must be knit together in this work as one man. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities for the supply of others' necessities. We must uphold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. We must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and community in the work as members of the same body. So shall we keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. The Lord will be our God and delight to dwell amongst us as his own people, and he will command a greater blessing. He will command a blessing upon us in all our ways, so that we shall see much more of his wisdom, power, and goodness and truth than formerly we have been acquainted with. We shall find that the God of Israel is amongst us, when 10 of us shall be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies, when he shall make us a praise and a glory that men shall say of seceding plantations, may the Lord make it like that of New England. Now, here comes the warning. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill, and the eyes of all people are upon us. So that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. We shall open the mouths of enemies to speak evil of the ways of God, and all professors for God's sake. We shall shame the faces of many of God's worthy servants, and cause their prayers to be turned into curses upon us, till we be consumed out of the good land whither we are going." That last part right there, the eyes of all the world will be upon us. And if we fail, a story and a byword we will become throughout the world. If we don't walk up to these covenants, the world will look back on America and say it was failed. And it failed because they couldn't keep the covenant. And we will give ammunition to the enemies of God and man to be able to say, see, man can't govern himself. Man has to have a king, a worldly king. to dictate how he should live. And that's not a society I feel like I want to join. So that's it. I hope that you and your family have a blessed holiday season here. I hope that Thanksgiving is great, that you were able to spend time with your family and enjoy them and the peace that this time of year has to give. I am so thankful. I have been blessed beyond measure, more than I deserve. First, I have access to the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. I have access to ordinances that assure me that my family can continue on forever and that we can be together as a unit for all eternity. That I can strengthen my resolve to be a better disciple and a better servant of Him. That I can do better at being a father and a husband and a better priesthood holder. Those are all promises that I have in front of me if I choose to take hold of them in the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. I am thankful for my family. I am so thankful for Amber and Tanya and for their unending willingness to watch me come in night after night and collapse on the bed just being exhausted. I will never not be thankful for them, and I hope to be able to be a better servant of theirs in the coming days. I'm thankful for my children. My children are better than me, every one of them. And I am so thankful for that, for their mother's example, and for the times I got things right, though rare they were. I'm thankful for living in the community that I am. I have wonderful people around me, and I love them like family themselves. And I am so grateful for that. And I'm grateful for you, the listener. I know your time is valuable, and I know your time is important, and I try not to waste it. And every episode I do, I think and pray about hard. And so if I fail, please know it's not out of laziness or not caring. I am so thankful you spend your time here with me. And I'm thankful for the friendship that many of you have extended to me. I love you, and I look forward to serving you more this next coming year. So with that, I hope all of you have a very blessed Thanksgiving, and thanks for listening. I love you. We'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.